most spiritual seekers will scour the internet looking for information with which to deepen their connection to themselves, to a power greater than themselves, or to gods or practices, tools, resources, so on and such. Should you do so, you'll soon encounter the phrase non-dual or non-duality or non-dualism. This ancient term has having a bit of a renaissance as there's a movement towards awakening or waking up or spiritual awakening, some sort of encounter with the accumulated work of looking at one's interior world, introverting oneself through mindfulness, through meditation, to silent prayer, through the contemplative orders, movements and tribes. And this word non-duality rather helpfully pops up quite frequently. I have no desire here to begin to talk about or pass on a message of non-duality, but it's interesting when we really look at it that non-dual or not two is in simple terms from here, and again, if you look, you'll find thousands of people very excited to pass that message on to you about non-duality, ranging from the intellectual, the academic, the deeply, deeply spiritual, those that wear the uniform of the non-dual communities, the spiritual accoutrements of the spiritual life, and the everyday, and the hardliners. There's even a way of expressing non-duality in fundamental or fundamentalist terms, somewhat. But all of this is probably a far better expression of what I'm going to attempt to do here, which is to briefly and succinctly, hopefully succinctly, dismiss what non-duality is. As I've said, it refers to the phrase not two. A lovely little phrase, cute little phrase, not two. What is that? So not two is another way of saying one, that we can't say that reality is one thing. The screen of reality, we might say, there's only one screen in which we see a waking world on when we get out of bed in the morning, and the first thought in the self, in the mind, arises and says, I am awake. It's the first thought we all have. It might not manifest for us as words themselves, but the recognition of having just woken up, and often the following phrase, oh, I was asleep, or better still, oh, I was a dream, describe what we would call states in non-dual terms. There's the sleep state, or the state of being so deeply into consciousness that there is no person. We don't know we're asleep because the personality and the energy of that personality evaporates as we go into deep sleep, as we drift into deep sleep. Then there's a dream state where the consciousness is able to view a set of circumstances, situations, people, places and things as they appear to us as dreamt-like characters in a dream-like narrative. And at sometimes at some accumulative pointer or point in the dream, we awaken. Maybe there's a sense of impending doom as the usual function in mind. This is just one way of looking at dreams. Comes to a sufficient place in the dreamt narrative that we wake. We're just awake, aren't we? Maybe the dream seems to reach some head, even though the circumstances of that head in the dream might be actually quite banal if we look. So there's the deep sleep state, there's the dreamt state, and then there's the waking state. We wake up. Now all of these states, in non-dual terms, whilst they bear significant exploration, actually what they do is illustrate to us or point us to, by a process of negation, well, when I fall asleep, even though my world and all the possessions and the objects of my usual waking world disappear when I'm in deep sleep, I am still here. when we drift into the dream state, or when the dream state appears, I am the observer of the dream. There may be a character called me in the dream. I may be a character in the dream, yet there's still a me observing the character. So the character, or let's call it here for loose terms, the personality that I take myself to be in the waking world, appears as a personality in the dreamt world. Yet, regardless, there's still a me, or an apparent sense of being me, that observes the dream. So the deep sleep state, the dreamt state, and the waking world are all observed by me as at first we would say, a subject. So there's a subject that I usually call I slept, I dreamt, I awoke, I carried out my day, I went about my business. Yet when we reduce those back, when we look before the dreamt state, or that in which the dreamt state appears and disappears, that in which a waking world appears and disappears, and that which, once all objects have disappeared or evaporated as I sleep deeply, I remain. So non-duality encourages us to explore that I that remains. So all of the states point to the no-self state, or that's the state in which the I thought arises. So that's a somewhat complicated way of expressing what I found non-duality offered me, gave to me, that I then spent 3 years studying, researching, listening intently every day, moving through different ways in which that developed for me as the previous Billy or Will that sat meditating evaporated, as I had an encounter with a quote misrepresented and attributed to St. Francis. I think St. Francis said something along the lines of, the God that you are looking for is the God that is looking, or the happiness that I sought was in the looking itself, or again, to use another religious way of saying it, the God that I was looking for was looking out through my eyes, watching me look. What I actually heard was, what's looking is what you're looking for. And like that, a simple, prosaic, everyday thought arose. The next, in 52 years of thinking, arose. But this time, what happened was nothing. Capital N, no thing. There wasn't an evocative experience, there wasn't enlightenment. There was a radically unending, peaceful, free, broad, unlimited, indivisible okayness. And the thought that followed that, the realization that followed that was that, if I quote someone else, Nisargadatta Maharaj, one of the last century's main proponents of traditional non-duality or Advaita Vedanta, who stated, having never left the house, we are looking for the way home. And I was in the midst of some process at the time where I was doing a lot more looking, because I'd had reason to, because of life events had given me a willingness to begin another spiritual process yet again. And in hearing what's looking is what you're looking for, I saw with absolute clarity that I was undertaking another search, and that all such searches that preceded this had brought me back to a pocket of happiness, a temporary window of relative and progressive peace, and that were I to continue down this next path, this next practice, I would arrive at the same point again. So practice, to some extent, to a large extent, and pathways and programs, all of that soon immediately the idea of them ground to a halt, and then the attempts to rework them ground to a grinding halt, because I simply had the recognition that I was going again, and then as I continued to try them, to journal, to meditate a certain amount of times every day and log how much I'd meditated, these just spoke to my egoic sense of having a spiritual will or a spiritual Billy. So that ended, and I've become increasingly happier since, born out of not an evocative experience or event, but born out of knowing the consequences of. So there's a knowing and there's a knowing of. Knowing the consequences of past practice and programs and who they really worked for. They can be helpful accoutrements to even a kind of non-dual way of living, or an undivided way of living, or to reality with an R, and there isn't a reality with a small r. For me, the recognition was also the recognition that reality with a small r only appealed to a sense of ego, that through self-inquiry and through further meditation, and use of medication, none of that, I was bound to once more build another sense of ego, as I saw that those practices and tools only spoke to that ego, that in undertaking a search of the ego, what was uncovered, what was realised was that there is no ego, there is no separate self, there is no character called will or Billy, there's just spontaneous, unending, free, broad, inclusive, never exclusive, radically okay nowness, we might say, or being, or beingness. So having said I wouldn't complicate non-duality, that might now seem somewhat complicated, but the way in which I'd like to really express what non-duality is, so that we can move past the words non-duality, because really, in the absolute sense, there's no non-duality, there's not even language, there's no need for a future outside of thought. Future cannot be found outside thought. The past cannot be found outside thoughts that arise now about events that are no longer happening. The way in which I'd articulate and like to articulate, and I'm going to articulate here, finally, you'd say, non-duality is to say that it's a way of framing, articulating, communicating to each other everyday reality as we know it, based on the understanding that mind is attached in time to previous events and future events, hopes that the future might be like the best parts of the past, or hopes that the terrible parts of the future don't repeat the terrible parts of the past. So the mind is concerned with in the moment, because the mind never leaves the moment. It never leaves the moment. The mind and thought is only ever the current thought that we're having. We're never doing more than one thing. We're never thinking more than one thing. There's never more than one activity. There might be apparent components to the current activity, multitasking, or doing a number of things, or trying to hold the mental tension of a number of things. But we're only ever doing that as a direct experience of present nowness or beingness or here-ness, whatever you want to call it. It doesn't really matter. It's too easy with non-duality and many other philosophies and schools to just get stuck at the meaning of words and not look at what they're pointing to. Words, language do limit non-duality, and what they do is they point us to it. They offer us a way of navigating and inquiring so that we come to a point of understanding. Every question that we'll have, every undertaking points us to understanding. And when understanding appears, yes, I get it. Once we get to I get it, or I understand, or I recognise, in lofty terms we call these things, in spiritual circles at least anyway, awakening or enlightenment, but these propose and suggest, and this is reinforced by much of our world search for meaning, tribes, that there's some kind of evocative event and we live in a state of bliss thereafter. Now, there are evocative events, there are peak experiences, there are ways in which we live in bliss. But seeking those appeals only to the ego, and we can very neatly, because the ego hears this message and then tries to become a spiritual ego, a non-dual ego, and we very neatly trap ourselves in that next pattern again, just as I saw myself doing quite quickly. So to reiterate, non-duality, for the purposes of simplifying it and probably doing it a significant injustice, because should you become involved in non-dual communities, spiritual communities that have a non-dual understanding of their particular way of expressing reality, you'll find a lot of questioners and a lot of seekers and a lot of inquiry necessarily, because people want to understand, and there's a time frame, and not everyone comes to understanding, so we continue to seek to understand. And of course there is, as we've alluded to, there's a lot of spiritual ego that wants to continue the verbal and mental narrative, to just because the message is being received by the sense separate self or the egoic self, because really the message isn't to that, it's to before that, it's coming out of before the ego and the separate self, same thing, same way of saying the different, same thing, and it's to be received by that sense of self that already knows. It's not a message of mental cognition, it's a message of recognition. We already know, so when we listen and we hear and we inquire and we join in like-mindedness, that which is due to speak to us, that which resonates, we already know anyway. We don't say, yes, I understand that, I get that. We say, yes, yes, because that's all we can say. And even the yes is an acknowledgement of an inner experience of understanding that, wow, when words fall away, when words empty out, understanding is reached. And when understanding is reached, words fall away and words empty out. And there's a knowing and a knowingness from our being in consciousness of peace and happiness. We might call that experience peace and happiness. The peace and happiness that we've looked for all along in the seeking, the paths, the practices, the programs, the questioning, the gurus, all of that stuff, which is good fun. And after one recognises reality as it is in simple but profound terms, those things are still fun. But we know why we're doing them, and we know the limits of overdoing. Reality is not two then, it is one. And seeking and not seeking are all part of that divine dance. Thanks.